All right, hello, and welcome to the first of what will be 5 different summaries, maybe 6 if we do monetary and budgetary policies separately, of all of Unit 3 and 4 VCE Economics for the current study design. It's been a long time since I filmed a video for economics, so let's see if we can get through all this in as much detail as possible. So we're going to go through the content one by one, and sometimes we'll do some application questions alongside the content, but for the most part, we're going to be trying to talk about the content and how it appears in different exam style questions to prepare you for the end of year exam in late October, Halloween Eve. So first up, we've got relative scarcity, needs and wants, resources, and opportunity costs. So first up, our relative scarcity is all about the balance of society's unlimited needs and wants against our limited resources to satisfy them. So we have a finite amount of resources in the world. Once we use them, they're gone. There are some renewable resources, but for the most part, we have non-renewable resources like coal. If we use all of coal, we can't use coal to make electricity. But as human beings, we want infinite electricity. So it creates a problem because we have to choose how to use these limited resources to satisfy our unlimited needs and wants in the way that best makes society happy, maximizes our overall living standards. This leads to what we call an opportunity cost. Because we can't make everything, so we have to decide what to produce, and the opportunity cost is the value or benefit foregone when choosing the next best alternative. Now, sometimes we look at this personally, so when you come to school, you give up sleeping in bed all day. In economics, we look at it in terms of the financial giving up. So when we build the Westgate Tunnel, what can that money not be spent on? So by funding part of the Westgate Tunnel, the government cannot spend that money on building a nuclear submarine or something of that like. We also have resources here. Resources comes up way less commonly in year 12, but our resources being our natural, labor, and capital resources, natural being gifts of nature, water, soil, etc. Labor being the skills and talents of our workers, like a doctor, a nurse, and our capital resources being the machines or plants and equipment we use to make goods and services. So if we looked at all this information, we could have a question that comes up about it, like outline how relative scarcity would lead to opportunity cost occurring. So with this, we kind of need to show, firstly, describing what relative scarcity is in terms of that outlining, and we're going to then link to how that would lead to opportunity cost. So we've got to show understanding of what opportunity cost is. We've got to show that it is the production foregone. Then we're going to show how relative scarcity ties in with opportunity cost. So if we did this, first up, relative scarcity refers to the balance of unlimited needs and wants and limited resources. Opportunity cost refers to the benefit foregone when choosing the next best alternative. Both those things really, really clear. But then lastly, we're going to talk about how one leads to the other, what the relationship is between them. So because of our limited resources, choices have to be made about which goods and services will be produced, which means that something will be given up, therefore causing an opportunity cost. And that should get you all 3 of those marks. Next up, we've got the nature of and conditions for a perfectly competitive market. A perfectly competitive market is the only market structure we do in year 12. And a perfectly competitive market kind of assumes there are no real government restrictions in that market. So we have many buyers and sellers. It means there is a ton of different businesses competing over the same good or service. Homogeneous goods, which means no product differentiation. No matter who is selling that product, it is the exact same thing. Think of apples, think of potatoes. That one type of apple, anyone selling it, you're just going to go to the cheapest one. Ease of entry and exit, which means that resources are mobile. So resources are mobile, which means that businesses can very quickly change what they are producing to match society's changing needs and wants. So resources are mobile. So if there is a change in things like relative prices, which we'll talk about later, that will mean that businesses will reallocate resources to what is ever going to make them the most profit. And then finally, firms are also what we call price takers. That means that consumers have all the power. There is something that we call consumer sovereignty, where in perfectly competitive markets, businesses have to produce the goods and services demanded by consumers, otherwise they will go out of business. So it means that we are going to achieve allocative efficiency, but more on that later on. So if we had to describe 2 characteristics of a perfectly competitive market, we could say that there are many buyers and sellers, which means there is a lot of different businesses competing in the same market. Then we could also talk about there are homogeneous products, which means that no matter who is selling the products, they are basically the same thing. Then we move on to our law of demand. So the law of demand is that as price increases, quantity demanded decreases. Now the opposite is also true. We could talk about when price decreases, that is going to lead to quantity demanded increasing. Either of those are true. Just think about yourself. When things get more expensive, what do you do? Now, there are two ways we can look at the demand curve. So when we have a demand curve, it looks like this. We're going to have price, we're going to have quantity, which we'll get into a little bit more later on. And a demand curve which slopes downwards. If you ever need to remember, demand starts with D, it slopes downwards. Demand. So there are two things we can look at. We can look at movements, which is when there's a change in selling price that leads to an expansion or contraction of demand. So only a change in selling price. That's really, really important. So it's just when you're going from one price, so if we go from P1 to P2, and what is going to happen. So when we go from P1 to P2, it means there is going to be a contraction of demand because people don't want to buy the product for a higher price. So the selling price changes, and that leads to a contraction or expansion of demand. If the price falls, it will lead to an expansion. So contraction is from price rising with demand, so an increase in price, and expansion is from price falling. Then we can also have shifts. So shifts are from non-price factors, so anything other than the selling price changing, that leads to a whole new demand curve existing. So non-price factors, and we'll get into these in more detail later on, but anything other than price changing, and it's going to lead you to have a new demand curve, either to the right, if it is favorable, so there's more demand at any given price, or to the left, where there is less demand at any given price. In this current state of design, we also have a couple of new things alongside the law of demand. We have the income effect and the substitution effect. Now, these have not really been asked on the end-of-year exam yet, so it's hard to know how explicitly they'll come up, and students aren't as confident with them. So the income effect refers to how a change in the price of a product is going to lead to be consumed, or it's going to consume a higher proportion of your household income and therefore lead to a contraction in demand. So for example here, we've got donuts for the product, and donuts have gone up in price. Donuts are now going to eat up, sorry for the pun, a larger proportion of your income. So you are going to demand less of them. That is going to be a contraction in the demand for donuts based on the income effect. Because they'll take up more of your income, you want less of them. Then we have the substitution effect, which refers to how when there's a change in the price of the product, it may lead a consumer to seek a cheaper substitute. So donuts have gone up in price. Due to the income effect, there's a contraction in demand. We now may demand more scrolls because scrolls are a substitute. So we're going to demand more scrolls based on that because of the substitution effect. So there's going to be a contraction in demand for donuts. And then because of the substitution effect, we are going to demand a different product that is a substitute for it. So to kind of test our knowledge around this, if we need to distinguish between a shift and movement in demand with reference to examples, whenever we need to distinguish requires us to define both concepts and point out the difference. So def, and diff. With this, our point of difference is the most important part. So what's the difference between a shift and movement in demand? Our key point of difference is whether or not the selling price changes. And that's really important. So the movement is just when the selling price changes lead to an expansion or contraction in demand, whereas a shift is where a non-price factor leads to a new demand curve being created at any given price. So if we're to look at the demand curve and what causes shifts in the demand curve, we have two main options which could occur. So if we label these axes with our price and quantity and then draw a demand curve on them, we could have one here and one here. And then there are two main options which could occur, and we're going to go through some of the factors as we go through them. So our factors are changes in disposable income, the price of substitutes and complements, preferences and tastes, interest rates, changes in population, and consumer confidence. What's really important here is you need to look at the factor and see if it's increasing or decreasing and what that means. So for example, if you have an increase in your disposable income, suddenly you're paying less tax or earning more overall, you are going to demand more of a product at any given price. That is going to lead to a new demand curve existing to the right, where at the same price, there is now a larger quantity demanded. That is a favorable shift in demand. We could also have an unfavorable shift in demand, which, if we look at another example, let's say, for example, interest rates increase. If interest rates increase, you are going to be paying more interest on a variable rate home loan, therefore having less disposable income or discretionary income, which is going to lead to less being demanded at any given price. And therefore that creates an unfavorable shift in demand. So if we had to identify which of the following would shift demand favorably or unfavorably, if we had a decrease in disposable income, that would be unfavorable. If we had a successful advertising campaign, that would be favorable. People would want more of that product. If government laws required helmets while riding bikes, well, now people are going to demand it at the same price, but there'll be more demand overall, so that's favorable. If there are subsidies for solar panels, that's going to be favorable because we're going to have them be cheaper. We're going to demand more of them. If there's an increase in the price of coffee, that's not actually going to shift it. That's going to cause an expansion or contraction. That is going to be a contraction, not a shift. If there's a decrease in personal income tax, that is going to be favorable as we're going to have a higher disposable income. Then we can put our law of supply. As price rises, quantity supplied increases. This is all because supply is from the point of view of businesses. Businesses are motivated by profit. That's part of the key knowledge point now. Profit motive for businesses. As the price rises, businesses will supply more. With movements, once again, it's only a changing selling price. If the selling price rises, that's an expansion. If it decreases, that is a contraction. Now shifts, once again, non-price factors, and they can be favorable or unfavorable. So non-price factors, and they're going to boil down to two main things. With supply, there's a number of factors we'll look at on the next slide, but they all boil down to changes in cost of production or productivity or efficiency. And they're the two key things that you can always tie any supply factor with. So if we look at these and we have supply curves, so our supply curves are always sloping upwards. If you ever need to remember that, a dumb way to remember that is that supply has the word up in it, and therefore it's an upward sloping curve. So we have price and quantity, price and quantity. And if we look through some of these, first up, changing cost of production. If you're a business and your cost of production goes down, what are you going to do? Well, you're going to want to supply more because it's now more profitable to supply, and that is going to lead to a favorable shift in supply because you can now supply more at any given price and retain more profit. If we were to look at climatic conditions, let's say there's a natural disaster. There is a cyclone in northern Queensland that wipes out your banana plantations. That is going to cause a shift to the left where you are unable to supply as much at any given price, and we call that an unfavorable shift in supply. So if we were to look at some of these scenarios and decide whether supply would shift favorably or unfavorably, if there is a decrease in wages, that is favorable for businesses because they are going to be paying less, they've got lower cost of production. If there's an increase in education and training, that's going to be favorable. We're going to be more efficient overall as a business. If there's an increase in business taxes, that is unfavorable. Cost of production is going up, and therefore businesses are less willing or able to produce. If there's subsidies for solar panel production, that's favorable. That's going to lower your cost of production. If there's an increase in the price of coffee beans for a cafe, that is an increase in your cost of production, and therefore that is unfavorable. And then finally, a decrease in the selling price of cake, that is just a contraction or expansion. If there's a decrease in the selling price, that is a contraction of supply, as it is now less profitable for you to sell cake. Then we get into looking at demand and supply together. Our equilibriums. Equilibriums are the price and quantity where supply and demand are equal. If we look at both things on the same axis, we've got demand, we've got supply. So then our equilibrium point is the price and quantity where supply and demand are equal. And that's really important. There's a few important things with both on the same axis is that a few things happen. If the price is set above the equilibrium point, so we have the price up here, we end up with a situation where supply is greater than demand. And we call that point above here a surplus, as there is too much demand at any given point. If the price is set below the equilibrium point, things are too cheap, supply is much lower than demand, and we end up with what we call, this point in here, a shortage. And eventually the market will fix itself. So if we look at a few of these things, what impact would they have on the original market? If there's an increase in the price of eggs for a bakery making cakes, well, that is going to then lead to a change in the cost of production, and therefore there's going to be an unfavorable shift in supply. What's really important here is when we talk about these, if we have that unfavorable shift in supply, what's important is how we get to a new equilibrium. And how we get to a new equilibrium is we need to look at what's happening in the short term. So if we had this as a short answer question, we'd say if there's an increase in the price of eggs for a bakery making cakes, this represents an increase in cost of production. This is going to lead to an unfavorable shift in supply to the left, as we've drawn there, where less is supplied at any given price. This then leads to a shortage in the market for cakes as supply is less than demand. And then this leads to consumers bidding up prices until we reach a new equilibrium point at a higher price and lower quantity. If we talked about an increase in the price of butter for the market for bread, that is going to be an unfavorable shift in demand because they are complementary items. When there's an unfavorable shift in demand, that is going to lead to what we call a surplus, as there is less demand compared to supply. When we get to this point in that description, the surplus leads businesses to discount prices to clear off excess stock until a new equilibrium is formed at a lower price and quantity. If we were to run through the rest of these, a study is released highlighting the health benefits of poppy seeds. That is going to be favorable for demand. An increase in the minimum wage is going to be unfavorable due to cost of production, so that's supply. The price of donut is increased at the canteen. Well, that is going to depend. That's going to be an expansion or contraction. That's all about selling price, and therefore is going to be a movement. Coles using new self-serve checkouts to replace labor. Well, that is going to be favorable for supply as they now have a lower cost of production or they're more efficient. And interest rates are decreased on the market for housing. That could be either demand or supply, but either way, it's going to be favorable shift for both demand and supply. Then we have the meaning and significance of price elasticity of supply. So price elasticity is how responsive quantity supplied or demanded is to a change in price. So it just means that when price changes, how much quantity changes. So if price changes by 10%, maybe demand changes by 20 or 30%. So elasticity can be a number of things. It can be elastic, which means that a small change in price leads to a larger quantity in change of supply or demand. Or it can be inelastic, where a change in price leads to a smaller change in quantity supplied or demanded. So if we were to put some numbers with that, we could say a 5% change in price leads to a 20% change in quantity. Or with inelastic, we could have a 20% change in price leads to a 5% change in quantity. There's also uninelastic, where it's directly proportional, so it'd be like 10% and 10%. That's never going to come up. It might be a multiple choice question, but if it's the same ratio, it's unit elastic. So then what is meant by the price elasticity of supply and demand? Again, that word responsiveness is your friend. So how responsive supply and demand are to a change in price. So it's all about how responsive a changing price leads to a changing quantity supplied or demanded overall. So we have some factors affecting elasticity of demand. We've got four main factors. We've got the degree of necessity. We've got availability of substitutes, proportion of income, and time. Degree of necessity is it a need or a want? Is it a need or a want? So if something is a need, it is going to be inelastic, because no matter how much the price changes, you are still going to buy it. So for example, water is a need. You are going to pay your water bill no matter what. Therefore, if the price of water was to rise, so if we had an example here and we had P1 and P2, if the price of water rose, it wouldn't affect demand that much, because you're still going to need to consume water to survive. Whereas a want is more elastic. So for example, ice cream. If ice cream decreases in price, there is going to be a massive jump in demand for it because it is a luxury. So you might have a gigantic movement in overall quantity demanded there. With the availability of substitutes, if something has a lot of substitutes, it will be elastic. So lots of substitutes is going to be elastic, and not many substitutes or no substitutes will be inelastic. Proportion of income is a weird one. The larger a proportion of income something takes up, the more elastic it will be. So for example, a house. If house prices drop, it's elastic. People demand it a lot more. Whereas if something's a low proportion of your income, so we always use the example of a toothpick. If it's a few cents and it goes up to 4 cents, you're not really going to notice. So demand's not going to change that much. Then time is all about when you need that product. So with that, say for example, you need a flight today. It's inelastic. You've got to pay whatever price the flights are. Or if you're planning a flight for next year, it's more elastic because you've got time to wait to see if the price changes. Which is going to lead into exactly our next example here, with reference to a factor, outline the price elasticity of demand for flights. So we could say one factor affecting it is time, which refers to when you need a product. because if someone needed a flight in the short term, it would be more likely to be inelastic because a higher price is unlikely to have a large impact on quantity demanded. Then we've got elasticity of supply. So we've got three main factors for that. We've got spare capacity, which refers to how much plant or equipment you have available to make more. So if you're at capacity, you can't produce any more, therefore supply is going to be inelastic. If you have a lot of spare capacity, it's going to be elastic because you can quickly, if price changes, use more of your equipment to make more. Production period is about how long it takes to make that product. So if something takes a long time to produce, it's going to be inelastic. I often think about like agricultural goods, like strawberries, with being inelastic. If the price of strawberries goes up, it takes months to grow. Therefore, you can't respond quickly in supply. However, if something's quick to produce, like a service, like say, for example, we could even say like Netflix subscriptions. It takes them no time to create a new subscription because there's almost infinite service space they have available. Therefore, that's more elastic in supply because the price goes up, they can supply a whole lot more quickly. And then lastly, we've got the durability of goods. This refers to how perishable things are. If goods are perishable, they're likely to be inelastic in supply because you've just got to sell them at whatever price is available. Whereas if something's non-perishable and it can be stored, it's going to be elastic because you can keep it in storage, wait for the price to change, and then supply more overall. So if we were to look at how to apply this, we could look at one factor to affect the price elasticity of supply for cars. We could talk about the fact that cars have a long production period, and therefore because of the long production period, it is going to mean that suppliers cannot respond quickly to a change in price, and therefore they're going to be inelastic in supply, as an increase in price is not going to lead to a large change in quantity supplied overall. Now to get back into relative prices. So once again, refers to the ratio of selling price between two similar goods or services. And when relative prices change, this sends a price signal to producers who then investigate the cause of the price change. This can lead to two different things happening. One is if it's demand related. This means that producers will reallocate resources towards the production as it's more profitable. If it's supply related, they'll allocate resources away from production as it's more expensive and not more profitable to produce. So really important, demand towards because it's more profitable, supply away because it's not more profitable. It's about the businesses trying to maximize their profit. So if the price increases because of demand, that is good. I'm going to show you two examples of this now. So explain how an increase in demand for a good can lead to a change in relative prices and how this would impact resource allocation. So first up, we need to describe a changing factor. So an increase in demand in a good for a non-price factor, such as favorable advertising, can lead to a shortage in the market and upward pressure on prices. This leads to an increase in relative prices as it's now more expensive relative to a similar good or service. Businesses would then investigate the cause of this change. Due to the change being demand related, businesses will then reallocate resources towards production as it's more relatively profitable. So that's the demand side. On the supply side then, you'd have to stay away from it. So if we look at some of these examples here, we've got to work out whether it's going to be towards or away from that production of that good. So if there's a price increase due to an increase in productivity or popularity, that is going to be demand-based and that is going to be allocating towards it because it's now more profitable. If there's a price increase due to an increase in wage costs, that's supply side, that is adverse supply conditions, that is going to be shifting away from it because it's not more profitable. If there's a price increase due to a natural disaster, there's also going to be an increase or adverse supply side factor and be shifting resources away. Then finally, if there's an increase due to a fall in the price of a complement, that is demand-based, that is going to be shifting towards that production because it's now more relatively profitable. Then we get into our efficiencies. We've got 4 efficiencies in Year 12 economics. This is defining them in their simplest form. Allocative efficiency is the only combination of production that maximizes living standards. So no other combination could make living standards better. We've got technical or productive, which is the least cost for the maximum output. We have dynamic efficiency, which is changing production to match society's changing needs and wants. So it's how quickly we can reallocate resources to achieve allocative efficiency. Then intertemporal efficiency is balancing resources for use between now and future time periods. So it's about not using all of our resources now, so some are left for the future. One specific thing in our new study design for this is how they align with the production possibility diagram. So if we look at the production possibility diagram, we have the hypothetical model of producing 2 products and what different points on this model mean for efficiency. So with allocative efficiency, there is only one point which will be considered allocatively efficient. So there's only one combination of productions which would lead to society's living standards being maximized. So only one spot is going to be allocatively efficient. However, everywhere on that curve is going to be technically efficient. So everywhere on that curve is technically efficient because that is using all of our resources for the maximum output. So least cost, most output. And then we've got dynamic efficiency. That is all about how quickly we can move from one point to another. So that's going to be dynamic, how quickly we can reallocate from one point to another. And then with our intertemporal, it shouldn't really come up, but intertemporal is going to be, say, for example, we are producing inside that curve. We are saving resources for future time periods. Then we've got the effect of competitive markets on the efficiency and resource allocation. So we've talked about competitive markets before, many buyers and sellers, ease of entry and exit, homogeneous goods. So competitive markets are forced to use their resources as efficiently as possible, or they'll struggle to compete. So if they're not efficient, they will die. Due to the fact there are many buyers and sellers, it means that consumers can shop around and purchase goods and services from the best value option to maximize their utility, and this achieves allocative efficiency. This forces businesses to cut costs and increase their productivity, which achieves technical efficiency. On the downside, because this could come up in a discuss or evaluate the efficiency and resource allocation of competitive markets. On the downside, due to consumer sovereignty, which is businesses producing the goods and services that consumers demand at a price they're willing to pay, it leads to an oversupply of socially undesirable goods or negative externalities that come from goods such as cigarettes, alcohol, gambling, etc. And then this undermines the achievement of allocative efficiency. So competitive markets, while they achieve allocative and technical, or they can achieve them, they can also undermine allocative efficiency because of the fact that consumer sovereignty exists and we consume a lot of goods and services that are not good for us. Then we have our 4 types of market failure. We have public goods, which are goods which tend to be underproduced because they're not profitable. Anyone can use them. They're non-rivalrous and non-excludable, which means that non-rivalrous means someone consuming it, it's still going to exist for everyone else. And it's non-excludable, meaning that anyone can use it. This is things like footpaths, street lights, anything that is freely available to the public, you can't stop them from using it. Then we've got externalities, which are an unintended impact, positive or negative, on a third party from production. So things like pollution is a good example of that. For a positive externality, say, for example, they build a school near your house. Your house goes up in value. That's an unintended positive impact for you because of that production. We've got asymmetric information where consumers know less about a sale than the seller. For example, secondhand cars, they might sell you a car with faults, but not tell you about them, leading to an overconsumption overall. Then common access resources, very similar to public goods, but these are resources which are freely available to be consumed by anyone. They are rivalrous, so if someone consumes it, it no longer exists. And then non-excludable, which means without any laws, anyone can consume those resources. What's really important with all of these market failures is you need to be able to point out whether they are underproduced, overproduced, overconsumed, or underconsumed. Let's skip over this question. So how do we fix these market failures? One way is indirect taxation. So the government can place taxes on things such as polluting, so that can slow down the negative externalities. So there is indirect tax on cigarettes, alcohol, so they're not overly consumed, which would cause negative impacts on the healthcare system. There can be subsidies to promote the production or consumption of goods and services with positive externalities. There can be government regulations, so laws and legislation to prevent the consumption of certain goods and services, so things like fishing licenses. There's government advertising to help correct asymmetric information, so the fact that we have to have all nutritional information available. There's government intervention or direct provision, where the government directly provides things such as public goods if the public will, or the businesses will not produce them. Then we get to our final point, which is one contemporary example of government intervention in markets, which has led to a decrease in the efficiency and resource allocation. Now, my preferred option for this is to talk about the minimum wage. So with this, we need to do three things. We need to talk about what the minimum wage is. So the minimum wage sets a price floor in the market for labor. And what that means is that the price is set above the equilibrium price. If we look at that in a diagram, the price is actually set up here, which means there's going to be an oversupply of labor, more labor supply compared to what suppliers are willing to pay. The purpose of this is to improve living standards and give everyone a basic standard of living. But because it increases the cost of production, it undermines technical efficiency and may lead to higher rates of unemployment. You can also argue that this then undermines allocative efficiency because although it aims to give a higher standard of living, there might be higher unemployment and therefore less people are employed and having a good standard of living. All right, that's been this whole topic. It was very, very fast, even though it's still 31 minutes of yapping. I hope this was helpful, and I'll be back with Area 2, 3, and Unit 4 in the coming days. Have a great day. See you later.